Just moving on to a really big issue that's come up last week is the ceasefire deal in Gaza, agreed after 15 months of a devastating US Israeli genocide. How can we make sense of this development? And what's your assessment of the balance of forces in the region following all the atrocities that we've witnessed over the last 15 months?
Well, I think what we're seeing here is sort of a culmination of the US strategy from the beginning. I mean, when you really look at what took place with the genocide in Gaza and, the escalation in the West Bank and everything happening in occupied Palestine with this offensive by the Israelis, the United States had, in my view, not an exact identity of interest with Israel, but it had an identity of interest with Israel. And I think, the only way, in a way, to make sense of what the US strategy was is to connect it to the pivot to Asia, the so-called pivot to Asia that Obama put forward, basically containing China and shifting the US military focus there. Now, of course, since the mid 1970s, the vast majority of the US military, at least since the late 1970s, has been focused towards the Persian Gulf, Middle East, West Asia area, obviously because that is not only the crossroads of global commerce, but the center of the, or at least at that time, the center of the oil trade, and maybe even more importantly, not just the oil trade in general, where the vast majority of oil for Asia goes, which is, of course, the rising economic powers of the world, really starting around the same time, and even more so in the past 10 or 20 years. So obviously the way Obama laid it out was, if we want to actually confront China, we can't do everything at once. So if we view China as the biggest threat to the unipolar rule of the world by the United States, we got to disengage from the Middle East. But they can't just randomly disengage because they're not engaged for some random reason. They're engaged because they don't want there to be any sort of independent powers in the region that can use their sort of geostrategic reality to, improve their own countries, elevate their own position in the world order, whatever it may be, to basically just reduce the total access to the region and total control of the region that the US has been trying to maintain for quite some time. So obviously to do that, they had to pursue what Obama and what Trump and others had continued, and Biden had continued, which was to try to find some way to create a balance of power to keep the Western-based interest in the driver's seat there in that region. And of course, Israel sold itself to the West when it created itself exactly that way. It has functioned as, some people say it's like an aircraft carrier on land. I mean, it is the guarantor of Western imperial interest in that region. So to create some sort of alliance anchored on Israel in order to be able to make sure that countries like Iran or, any other Arab country that would decide to have some level of sovereignty and switch their position, that nobody could find a way to sort of push the West out, right? So ultimately, that's what led to normalization, all these different sort of pieces. I mean, in many ways, that's what the Iran deal was actually about under Obama, was creating kind of like a cold peace between an Israel-Saudi kind of bloc is what I think Obama was hoping for. Then you had the normalization, kind of the same thing under Trump and under Biden as well. But nonetheless, the main roadblock to actually carrying this out is the Palestinian struggle, because the masses of people in West Asia do not want to see the Palestinian struggle totally erased. They want to see justice for Palestine, and that has the opportunity to disrupt the entire process of normalization, and that's what happened on October 7th. So for the United States, you have this situation where for them, I think it was right and perfect, even though this is so terrible to think that someone would think like this, but I think this is how they think, for Israel to wage this genocidal war, because it was addressing their biggest issue, which was that they couldn't really fully complete this normalization process without erasing the Palestinian cause. So ultimately, their hope, I think, was this will be an opportunity to totally erase the Palestinian movement, to totally erase all of the Palestinian factions, to impose upon the Palestinians, the US view of like a colonial style, quote unquote, peace. And I think in a Machiavellian way, I think the US was also hoping that this would dent Israel's reputation and also make Israel more dependent on the United States, which again further helps them shape the environment the way they want to shape the environment in the Middle East, in balancing between all the various different interests. So Biden, I think that's why he went along with this. I mean, everyone is saying, oh, well, Biden just didn't want to use his leverage to stop the genocide in Gaza. I mean, he obviously didn't want to use his leverage, but I don't think it's just because he was like bad or weak or whatever. I think it's because he felt like, yes, this is good. Like, we need to keep this going because it'll help our agenda. Now, we've gotten all this way, and I think Trump about to come into office can see that ultimately it's not working out exactly the way they wanted it to work out. And that in some senses, yes, they have succeeded in shifting things in the region in a way that I think can potentially make things slightly more favorable, and I'll come to that in a second. But ultimately, they cannot crush the Palestinian people. The Israelis were totally unable to destroy the Palestinian resistance despite having all of the resources in the world. So there's really not that much more, I think, that Trump and the broader US foreign policy establishment felt like they could get out of this, and that they better make a deal now before things start to shift somehow in the other direction. And who knows how that could be, but the longer this goes on, the more inflamed the conflict becomes, the more the unintended, sort of unexpected aspects of the solidarity movement with Palestinians around the world could shift different things. If you make the peace now, you've got a so-called peace, ceasefire, whatever you want to call it. Syria has fallen, and that was a country that was, whatever one might say about it, was opposed to the U.S. agenda broadly in the region. Iran is a little bit on the back foot and having, its own internal issues as well. Iraq, there's some turmoil there in terms of what's going to happen with the various different forces that are more opposed to the U.S. agenda. Lebanon, obviously, sort of similar sort of issue. So you've got a situation where they might not have everything they want, but they're able to perhaps do more to shape the region to make it easier to disengage a little bit from the Middle East. They might have a more reliable, pliable government in Syria. They may have a little more calm in the Lebanon front. Iran, maybe they can work a deal, or, at the very least, they may have to take a little bit of a step back and be a little bit more open to making deals with the West because, they have their own issues and their own troubles. Iraq, we don't know exactly what's going to happen there, but they may be able to shift the politics a little bit in that regard. All these different sort of pieces that I think come into this. Now is the opportunity, perhaps, even if they can't push the Abraham Accords or normalization that much further, at least they can have enough of a modus vivendi in terms of feeling like they are shaping things that it will facilitate the broader goal of moving forward. Hence why they were willing to, tell the Israelis, like, okay, now's the time. Like, I don't think Netanyahu or anyone else was chomping at the bit to stop the genocide. But the U.S. said, you know what? Now's the time. We got what we needed to get out of this, or as much as we could get out of this. Now we need to switch to a new modality if we want to continue our same basic thing. So that's my general feeling, about sort of why this is happening now, because I think the overall objective of the United States in West Asia right now, vis-a-vis the Palestinian struggle, is to find a way to disengage more from the region by creating a more stable status quo for Western powers. And I think they feel they've reached that point to the best they can right now. And now they want to move forward and move on and pursue their sort of broader goal, which I think will be to continue to try to shift more towards confronting China. And that's a big conversation when you look at some of the people, Elbridge Colby, all these other people, who's going to be the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy, who they're bringing in, who are 100% against China. And they have this view that the U.S. has to make hard choices. So that's why a lot of them say we got to wind down the war in Ukraine. Same thing with the Middle East. Like, we can't be deeply involved in these wars in West Asia. It's taking our eye off the ball of really slowing down China. And I think that's why Trump was willing to move aggressively at this moment, because they were able to get, some victories. I mean, I think for the imperialists, the fall of Assad is a victory for them because a roadblock, whatever the contradictions, is gone. I think the fact that Hezbollah, which, I think the world feels fought very bravely, but obviously took some big hits, and the internal situation in Lebanon, things are sort of turning more in that direction, that was a victory for them, even if Hezbollah is not destroyed in any way, shape, or form, if they had to take a little bit of a step back. Obviously, the Palestinian people are going to have to rebuild and continue to do things, so they're not destroyed, but they're going to be also focused very much on rebuilding their society and internally. Iran, Iraq, all these different places. I think there's a kind of doom and gloom among some people, and I think that makes sense, that Israel's doing whatever they want. The U.S. is winning everything. I don't think that's exactly the case. I think that they're making this deal now because they're fearful the balance of power that makes them look so victorious now could potentially shift in dangerous ways if the genocide was ongoing.